This was the first lesson Verethkin had learned as a child, watching the funeral pyres of his ancestors drift into the cold embrace of the Velfori Nebula. His mother had held his small hand, her crystalline skin reflecting the distant light of dying suns, and she had whispered the ancient truth that every member of their species came to understand. The stars burn. The stars die. The stars do not weep for what passes beneath them. Now, 11,000 years into his life, Verethkin understood this lesson with a clarity that carved hollows into his chest. He stood at the observation deck of the Eternal Vigilance, the last surviving command vessel of the Velthori Ascendancy, and he watched the distant glow of his homeworld's final death. Velthora Prime had burned for 3 cycles now. The fires were so vast, so complete, that they could be seen from 7 light minutes away, a wound of orange and white against the backdrop of a galaxy that had suddenly become hostile beyond comprehension. The stars did not mourn, but Verethkin did. His reflection stared back at him from the observation glass, and he barely recognized the creature he saw there. His crystalline plates, once a luminous azure that denoted his position on the High Council, had faded to a dull gray. The ridges along his temples, marks of wisdom earned through millennia of service, now seemed like cracks in ancient stone, ready to crumble. His 4 eyes, arranged in the traditional diamond pattern of his caste, were hollow with exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. 40 billion. The number echoed in his mind like a death knell. 40 billion Velthori souls had lived on the homeworld, 40 billion minds, each one carrying the accumulated wisdom of a species that had mastered interstellar travel, while humanity's ancestors were still learning to chip stone into crude tools. Gone. Not captured, not enslaved, not even conquered in the traditional sense. Simply gone. The harvesters did not conquer, they consumed. Verethkin closed his primary eyes, allowing his secondary pair to maintain watch on the burning horizon. Behind him, the command deck hummed with frantic activity, officers coordinating what remained of the evacuation, analysts tracking the enemy's methodical advance, communications specialists sending out signals that no one seemed to receive. Signals that had gone unanswered for months. The Velthori Ascendancy had spent 8,000 years building a civilization that spanned 600 worlds. They had developed technologies that could terraform planets, harness the energy of stars, and extend life beyond what any species should reasonably expect. They had watched younger races rise and fall with the detached interest of beings who had seen it all before. They had been gods among the lesser species of the galaxy, and the harvesters had broken them in less than a standard year. Elder Verethkin. The voice came from behind him, trembling with barely contained fear. He turned to face Ilrisven, one of his few remaining aides. She was young, barely 2,000 years old, and the terror in her eyes reminded him of how he must have looked during his first glimpse of true war.
What is it? A signal. We've received a response to our distress beacon.
For a moment, hope flickered in Verethkin's chest, a dangerous thing, hope. It had been dying slowly with each passing day, with each world that fell silent, with each fleet that vanished into the harvester's endless maw. He had learned to suppress it, to focus only on the grim mathematics of survival. From whom? He asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. The Cartheki Federation? The Luminari Collective? Ilrisven hesitated. Her crystalline plates shifted through several shades of uncertainty. a physiological response that she was still too young to control. Neither, Elder. The signal originated from the soul system. Virithkin felt something cold settle in his chest. Soul? Yes, Elder. The human homeworld. For a long moment, Varathkin simply stared at his aide. The humans. Of all the species in the galaxy to respond to a Velphori distress call, it was the humans. He remembered the first contact, 400 years ago by human reckoning. The Velphori observers had detected the primitive radio signals bleeding out from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star. They had watched with mild curiosity as the young species stumbled into space, their first vessels crude and inefficient, their lifespans so short that individual achievements seemed almost meaningless. The Council had debated whether to make contact. Some had argued for observation only, let the primitives develop on their own, or, more likely, destroy themselves as so many young species did. Others had pushed for limited engagement, if only to prevent the humans from accidentally triggering some ancient weapon left behind by extinct civilizations. In the end, the Council had settled on dismissal. The humans were too young, too violent, too unpredictable. Their history was a blood-soaked tapestry of wars fought over resources, ideology, and simple hatred. They killed each other with an enthusiasm that bordered on pathological. They had nearly rendered their own world uninhabitable through sheer negligence. Give them 1,000 years, the Council had concluded. If they survive their own nature, perhaps then they will be worth acknowledging. That assessment had been made 320 years ago. They responded to our beacon? Varathkin asked, unable to keep the disbelief from his voice. The humans? Yes, Elder, but there is a complication. Ilrizven's uncertainty deepened. Our beacon was damaged in the initial attacks. The communication specialists believe that the humans received only a fragment of our transmission, partial coordinates, partial identification, no tactical data, no information about the enemy, no warning about what they would be walking into. Yes, Elder. Verithkin turned back to the observation window. In the distance, Velthora Prime continued to burn. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon of fire and ash, the harvesters were still feeding, still growing, still preparing to move on to the next cluster of worlds. And now the humans were coming. For reasons he could not fully articulate, this thought disturbed him more than it should have. The humans were young, weak, technologically limited. Their fleet was small, their experience with true interstellar warfare non-existent. They had never faced an enemy like the Harvesters, had never even conceived of a threat that could consume entire civilizations. They were walking into an abattoir, and they didn't even know it. How long until they arrive? He asked. They responded that they would reach the beacon coordinates within 6 cycles. 6 cycles? Verithkin turned sharply. That's impossible. Sol is nearly 40 light-years from our beacon's location. Even with our most advanced drives, that journey would take... I know, Elder. I told them the same thing. They simply acknowledged and repeated their timeline. Verithkin felt the first stirrings of something other than despair. Curiosity, perhaps, or confusion. The humans were either lying, delusional, or in possession of technology far beyond what the Velthori had observed 3 centuries ago. None of those options made sense. Prepare a delegation, he said finally. If the humans are truly coming, we will meet them at the beacon coordinates. If they have come to offer aid, we will accept it
even if that aid amounts to nothing more than additional witnesses to our extinction."
He paused, looking once more at the distant fire that had been his world.
"And if they have come for some other purpose, we will learn that as well."
The human vessel arrived precisely when they said it would.
Verethkin stood in the observation chamber of the Eternal Vigilance, watching the impossible occur with his own 4 eyes. The space around the beacon coordinates rippled, twisted, and then tore open like a wound in reality itself. From within that wound emerged a ship.
It was not what he had expected.
The Velthori built their vessels for elegance as much as function. Every line was calculated to reflect the beauty of mathematical perfection, every surface designed to capture and refract light in ways that evoked the crystalline nature of their species. A Velthori warship was a work of art that happened to also carry weapons capable of shattering moons.
The human ship was functional.
It was gray, unadorned. Its hull was covered with what appeared to be modular sections, each one slightly different from its neighbors, as if the vessel had been assembled from components that were never meant to fit together. Sensor arrays protruded at irregular angles. Weapon emplacements sat in housings that looked almost haphazard.
The ship looked like it had been built by beings who cared nothing for aesthetics and everything for utility. It looked like it had been built to survive.
"Vessel identification confirmed," one of the bridge officers announced. "Human designation, the Montgomery. It appears to be a cruiser-class vessel, approximately 2 kilometers in length."
2 kilometers. One of the smallest capital ships in the Velthori fleet. Verethkin felt a grim amusement at the thought of what this single vessel could possibly do against the harvesters who traveled in swarms that blotted out the stars.
"They are hailing us, Elder."
Except the communication. The holographic display flickered to life, and Verethkin got his first look at a human face.
The being on the screen was female, if he remembered the species' dimorphism correctly. Her skin was a warm brown, her hair cropped close to her skull, her eyes a dark shade that reminded him uncomfortably of the void between stars. She wore a uniform of muted colors, gray, black, a single insignia on her collar that he did not recognize.
But what struck him most was her expression, or rather, the lack of one.
The Velthori were an ancient species, and they had learned to read the emotional states of other beings through countless millennia of observation. Fear, anger, curiosity, aggression, these were universal responses that transcended biological differences. The human's face showed none of them. She looked at him with an assessment so calm, so measured, that Verethkin found himself unsettled in ways he could not immediately explain. "Elder Verethkin of the Velthori Ascendancy," the human said. Her voice was even, controlled. "I am Captain Sarah Chen of the UEN Montgomery. We received your distress beacon." "Captain Chen." Verethkin inclined his head in the traditional gesture of acknowledgement. "We are surprised by your response. Our beacon was damaged. We did not expect anyone to receive it, let alone act upon it." "The signal was degraded," Chen agreed. "We received approximately 18% of the original transmission, coordinates, a species identifier, and one word that repeated 17 times before the signal collapsed entirely."
What word?
The captain's dark eyes held his gaze. "Help." Verethkin felt something tighten in his chest. He had not known that. He had not known that their desperate, broken plea had been reduced to a single word, repeated into the void like a dying heartbeat.
"Help! Help! Help! Help!"
"You came," he said quietly. "You received a broken message from a species that has offered you nothing but dismissal, and you came."
"You asked for help. We did not even know you could hear us."
For the first time, something shifted in the human's expression. It was subtle, a slight softening around her eyes, a barely perceptible relaxation in the set of her jaw. Verethkin had the sudden, uncomfortable sense that he was being studied by something that understood far more than it revealed. "Elder Verethkin," Captain Chen said, "may I come aboard your vessel? I believe we have much to discuss, and I would prefer to do so face to face." He hesitated. Every instinct honed by millennia of diplomacy screamed at him to be cautious, to probe for hidden motives, to understand what the humans wanted before allowing them any closer. But exhaustion had worn away his defenses, and desperation had stripped him of his pride. "You may," he said, "but I must warn you, Captain, our situation is dire beyond anything you can imagine. What you will see, what you will learn, it may change how you view the galaxy forever." The human's expression did not change. "Elder, we received 18% of a broken signal from an unknown species, and we traveled 40 light years to respond. I don't think you fully appreciate what we were prepared for." Captain Sarah Chen stepped off the shuttle with 2 escorts flanking her. They were human males, both of them tall and broad-shouldered, their faces set in the same unreadable calm that marked their commander. They carried no visible weapons, but Verethkin noticed how their eyes moved, constantly scanning, assessing, cataloging. They moved like predators pretending to be prey. "Welcome to the eternal vigilance," Verethkin said, forcing warmth into his voice that he did not feel. "It is the last operational command vessel of the Velthori Ascendancy." Chen looked around the hangar bay with what might have been curiosity. The chamber was vast, designed to hold hundreds of support craft for a fleet that no longer existed. Now it held only the captain's shuttle and a handful of damaged vessels that would never fly again. "The last," she repeated quietly. It was not a question. 6 months ago, we maintained a fleet of 12,000 capital ships. Today, we have 17. Chen turned to face him. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, "How many worlds have fallen?" 473. "And the casualties?" Verethkin's crystalline plates shifted to a shade of deep gray. Mourning, grief, exhaustion. "We stopped counting after the first 100 billion. He expected shock, horror, perhaps disbelief or denial. These were the reactions he had seen in other species when they learned the scope of the catastrophe. The brief, desperate hope that he was exaggerating, followed by the slow, terrible understanding that he was not. Chen's expression did not change. "Show me," she said. They walked through the corridors of the eternal vigilance, and Verethkin told her everything. "We do not know where they come from," he admitted as they passed through a corridor lined with memorial plaques, names of ships that would never return, commanders who had died in desperate holding actions. "We do not know what drives them, or if they can even be communicated with. We know only that they consume and grow and move on." "How long were they dormant?" Verethkin glanced at her sharply. "You presume they were dormant?" "Something this destructive doesn't just appear. If the harvesters had been active for any significant period, we would have noticed the gaps in the galactic structure, dead zones where stars should be, regions of space that your records say were populated, but now show nothing." Chen's eyes met his. "We looked, Elder, before we came. We analyzed every piece of data we could find about this region of space. The harvesters are new, or they've been sleeping for a very long time. For a moment, Varathkin simply stared at her. The humans had been spacefaring for barely 3 centuries. They had been a recognized species for even less. And yet this woman spoke of galactic analysis, of pattern recognition across distances that should have been beyond her species' capability.
"You are not what we expected," he said quietly.
No, Chen agreed. We rarely are.
They continued walking. The corridors grew emptier as they moved deeper into the ship. Areas that had once been filled with crew members, now echoing with the footsteps of ghosts. "How many of your people remain?" Chen asked. "Across all surviving vessels and installations? Perhaps 3 million. 3 million, she repeated. From how many? At our height, the Velthori ascendancy numbered 240 billion souls across 600 worlds. Chen stopped walking. For the first time, Varathkin saw something shift in her expression. Not shock, not horror, but something deeper. Something that looked almost like recognition. "Your species is facing extinction," she said. It was not a question.
Yes, and you sent out distress beacons. To everyone.
We were desperate. We did not expect. You sent to us. Chen turned to face him fully. 3 centuries ago, your council dismissed humanity as too young, too violent, too unpredictable to be worth acknowledging. You decided we were not worthy of contact. And when the harvesters came, when your civilization was burning, you sent a distress beacon to Sol anyway. Varathkin felt something cold spread through his chest. Shame, perhaps, or the remnants of the pride that his species had once carried so easily. "We sent beacons everywhere," he admitted. "We did not expect you to receive ours. We did not expect anyone to answer." "But we did." "Yes, you did." Chen was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that Varathkin had not heard before. "Elder, 300 years ago, when your observers first detected our signals, what did your analysts conclude about humanity?" He hesitated. "That you were young, aggressive, self-destructive, and that you would likely destroy yourselves within a few centuries. Your wars, your environmental degradation, your seemingly pathological inability to cooperate with your own species." He paused, feeling the weight of hypocrisy settling on his shoulders. "We believed you were too flawed to survive." Chen nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "You were right, in a way. We are aggressive. We are violent. We have spent most of our history finding new and creative ways to hurt each other." She turned to face one of the memorial plaques on the wall, a list of ships that had been lost in the early days of the war, before the Velthori had understood what they were facing. "But you missed something in your assessment, Elder. Something important." "What did we miss?" Chen reached out and touched the plaque, her fingers tracing the unfamiliar script of the Velthori language. "You saw our wars and concluded that we were self-destructive. You saw our conflicts and assumed that we would tear ourselves apart." She turned to face him, and in her dark eyes Varathkin saw something that made his ancient hearts skip a beat. "But you never asked why we kept fighting. You never wondered how we survived, despite everything we did to ourselves." "I do not understand." "Humanity has faced extinction before, Elder. Not once, but many times. Ice ages that nearly wiped us out, diseases that killed half our population, wars that consumed entire generations. We have stood on the edge of oblivion so many times that it has become part of who we are. She stepped closer, and Varathkin found himself resisting the urge to step back. We are not violent because we are young or primitive or flawed. We are violent because we are survivors. We fight because we have always had to fight. And when we have nothing left to fight except each other, we turn that aggression inward. But when something threatens all of us, a ghost of something that might have been a smile crossed her face, we have learned to turn outward very, very quickly.
Captain Chen, Verethkine said slowly, are you telling me that humanity intends to fight the harvesters?
I'm telling you that humanity received a broken signal from a dying civilization, and we sent a response within hours. I'm telling you that the Montgomery is not a rescue vessel, Elder. It is an advance scout. Something in her tone made Varathkin's crystalline plates shift to a shade he had not felt in centuries. Advance scout? Chen turned toward the observation window at the end of the corridor. Outside, the stars burned with their eternal, indifferent light. When we left Seoul, the United Earth Navy began full mobilization. Every shipyard, every manufacturing facility, every reserve fleet was activated. By the time we received confirmation of your situation, the first wave was already en route.
Varathkin felt the deck shift beneath his feet, not physically, but in the way the universe itself seemed to tilt.
First wave? 1,200 capital ships, support vessels, troop transports, manufacturing platforms capable of producing replacement materiel in the field. Chen's voice remained calm, almost conversational. The second wave launches in 48 hours. The third wave in 72. Captain Chen, Verethkin struggled to keep his voice steady. How many waves are planned? As many as it takes. The words hung in the air between them. Verethkin stared at the human, searching her face for any sign of deception, exaggeration, or the blind bravado of a young species that did not understand what it was facing. He found nothing but calm certainty. You have never faced an enemy like the harvesters, he said carefully. You do not understand what they are capable of. You're right, we don't. Chen turned back to face him. But we know what we are capable of, Elder, and I don't think you do. Before Varathkin could respond, a chime sounded from the communication panel on the wall. He pressed the activation sequence, and Ilrisven's voice filled the corridor. Elder, multiple hyperspace signatures detected at the edge of the system. We are reading hundreds of contacts. Varathkin felt his heart's seize. Harvesters? No, Elder. Ilrisven's voice carried a tremor of something that might have been disbelief. The signatures match human vessel configurations. Hundreds of them. They are still emerging. Chen did not react. She simply looked at Varathkin with those dark, unreadable eyes and said, Advance Scout, Elder, I told you. The observation deck of the Eternal Vigilance had been designed to inspire awe. Its crystalline walls curved outward like the petals of a flower, offering an unobstructed view of the cosmos that surrounded the vessel. For 11,000 years, Varathkin had stood in this chamber and watched the stars, secure in the knowledge that his species had mastered the space between them. Now he stood frozen, unable to process what his eyes were showing him. The human fleet filled the view screen like a metal tide. Ships emerged from hyperspace in waves, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of vessels materializing in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the reflected light of distant stars. They were not beautiful. not elegant, not works of art that also happened to carry weapons. They were brutal, functional, and terrifying in their sheer numbers. 1,247 capital ships! Ilrisven's voice came through the communication channel, strained with disbelief. Over 3,000 support vessels. Unknown number of smaller craft still emerging from carrier bays. Elder, this is not possible.
Verithkin turned to Captain Chen, who stood beside him watching the arrival of her people with an expression of quiet satisfaction.
3 centuries, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You have been spacefaring for 3 centuries. How is this possible? We build quickly, Chen replied, when we have to. But the resources alone, the manufacturing capacity, the coordination required.
Elder Verithkin. Chen's voice was gentle, almost kind. Your species has existed for over 100,000 years. You have had millennia to develop your technology, your infrastructure, your ways of thinking. You built slowly, carefully, with the patience of beings who expected to live forever.
She turned to face him fully. And in her eyes, Verithkin saw something that he had never expected to see from a species his people had dismissed as primitive.
Understanding. Humanity has existed for a fraction of that time. We developed spaceflight barely 3 centuries ago. We achieved faster-than-light travel less than 200 years ago. We have been building, expanding, and preparing at a pace that your council probably found reckless.
Reckless, Verithkin repeated it.
Desperate, Chen corrected. We build like there is no tomorrow, because we have never been able to take tomorrow for granted. Our entire history is a story of survival against impossible odds. We do not have the luxury of patience.
She gestured toward the view screen, where the human fleet continued to assemble. Thousands of ships now hung in formation, their running lights creating a constellation that rivaled the stars themselves.
When your beacon reached us, when we understood that an extinction-level threat was moving through the galaxy, we did not debate. We did not form committees or hold votes or weigh the political implications. We mobilized.
In weeks, Verithkin said.
In hours. The elder felt his legs threaten to give way. He steadied himself against the observation rail, his crystalline plates shifting through shades of emotion that he could not name.
Why? He asked finally. You owe us nothing. We dismissed you. We ignored you. We treated you as primitives unworthy of acknowledgement. Why would you come to our aid?
Captain Chen was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the human experience.
Because someone was screaming for help, Elder, and we were close enough to hear.
Over the next 2 days, Verithkin learned what humanity meant by mobilization.
The first wave of ships was only the beginning. Behind them came manufacturing platforms, massive structures that unfolded like metal flowers, their automated systems immediately beginning to produce ammunition, replacement parts, and additional combat drones. Supply vessels disgorged resources that had been stripped from asteroid belts throughout human space. Medical ships established triage stations capable of treating casualties in the millions.
And still more ships arrived.
Every few hours, another wave emerged from hyperspace. Cruisers, destroyers, carriers, dreadnoughts. Some were old, their hulls showing the scars of conflicts that Verithkin had never heard of. Others were new, so recently constructed that their paint still looked fresh. All of them moved with a coordination that spoke of centuries of practice, millennia of refinement. How,
he asked Chen as they watched the third wave arrive. How do you coordinate so many vessels, so many crews? The logistics alone should be impossible.
Chen considered the question. We learned early that division was our greatest weakness. For most of our history, we fought ourselves, nations against nations, ideologies against ideologies. Billions died because we could not find common ground. She paused, watching as a squadron of heavy cruisers took up position on the fleet's flank. A century ago, we faced a crisis that threatened to end our species. Not an external enemy, but ourselves, our own weapons, our own mistakes, our own inability to cooperate. We came within hours of mutual annihilation. Her voice carried the weight of memory. After that, we changed. We had to. The United Earth government was formed, not out of hope, but out of necessity. The realization that if we did not learn to work together, we would die apart.
You unified your entire species? Verithkin asked.
Not perfectly. We still disagree, still argue, still struggle with our nature. But when a threat is recognized, when something endangers all of us, the arguments stop, the divisions collapse. We become one thing, moving with one purpose.
And that purpose now.
Chen's dark eyes met his. Your signal said help. We're here to help. On the third day, the harvesters came. Verithkin stood on the bridge of the Eternal Vigilance, surrounded by the remnants of his command staff, and watched the nightmare unfold. The swarm emerged from the direction of Velthora Prime, a dark tide that blotted out the stars as it moved. Millions of individual units, each one a horror of organic metal and consuming hunger. They moved in patterns that seemed random but were, Verithkin knew, terrifyingly efficient.
The Velthori sensors struggled to count them.
Contact estimates are climbing past 12 million, Ilaris Ven reported, her voice trembling. 16 million, 20 million. They keep coming. Verithkin felt the despair settle over him like a shroud. 20 million. The human fleet was impressive, but against 20 million harvesters? Captain Chen, he said into the command channel, you must withdraw. You cannot fight these numbers. Take your fleet and run. Warn the other species. Let us die buying you time. There was a pause. Then Chen's voice came back, calm as ever. Elder Verithkin, I appreciate your concern, but I don't think you understand what's happening. What do you mean? Look at your sensors again. Not at the enemy. At us. Verithkin frowned and redirected his attention to the human fleet positions. What he saw made his crystalline plates shift to pure white. The human ships were moving, not retreating, advancing, spreading out in a formation that he did not recognize, each vessel taking a position that seemed random until he saw the larger pattern emerging. They were creating a net. We've fought swarm tactics before, Chen explained, her voice carrying a hint of something that might have been anticipation. Not at this scale, but the principles are the same. Individual units are dangerous. Coordinated units are deadly, but coordination requires communication, and communication requires signals, Verithkin whispered. Every swarm has a hierarchy, a structure, something that tells the individual units where to go and what to do. Find that structure, disrupt it, and the swarm becomes nothing but a collection of parts. We tried that. The harvesters do not use conventional communication. We could not. You could not find their command structure because you were looking for something like your own, something centralized, something efficient. Chen's voice carried a note of dark amusement. We looked for something different.
On the tactical display, the human fleet completed its formation. 2,300 capital ships now formed a web that stretched across light seconds of space, each vessel precisely positioned relative to its neighbors.
The harvesters don't have a command structure in the traditional sense, Chen continued. They communicate through quantum entanglement. Instantaneous, impossible to jam, impossible to intercept. But entanglement has a weakness. It requires synchronization. And synchronized systems can be overloaded.
Overloaded? Every human vessel in this fleet is equipped with a quantum disruption array. Individually, they're useless, too weak to affect anything larger than a single unit. But together, coordinated, firing in a precise pattern.
On the view screen, the first wave of harvesters reached the edge of the human formation.
And then the universe went white.
Verethkin had witnessed the death of stars. He had seen planet crackers reduce worlds to rubble. He had watched entire fleets vanish in the nuclear fire of antimatter weapons.
Nothing had prepared him for what the humans did. The quantum disruption pulse rippled outward from the human fleet in a wave of light that was not quite light. It passed through the harvester swarm like a wind through dead leaves, and in its wake, the swarm shattered. Individual units that had been moving with terrifying coordination suddenly scattered, their synchronized movements becoming chaotic. Collisions cascaded through the swarm as units that had been operating in perfect harmony suddenly had no idea where their neighbors were. The darkness that had blotted out the stars fragmented into millions of confused, isolated pieces.
And then the human ships opened fire.
Railguns, missile batteries, energy weapons that Verethkin did not recognize. Point defense systems that filled space with a wall of destruction. The human fleet moved through the chaos like a blade through water, each vessel targeting the now vulnerable harvester units with mechanical efficiency.
The slaughter was absolute.
Forward elements are advancing. Chen's voice came through the command channel, calm as if she were reporting weather conditions. Enemy cohesion has collapsed across all sectors, engaging in full pursuit.
Verethkin watched in stunned silence as the human fleet carved through what had been an overwhelming enemy force. Ships that should have been insignificant against the harvester swarm moved with a precision that spoke of centuries of practice, their weapons finding targets with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural.
And behind the capital ships came something else. Smaller craft, fighters, bombers, assault vehicles, poured from the carrier bays in clouds of metal and fire. They swept through the fragmented swarm like a storm, destroying any harvester unit that had survived the initial assault.
It was not a battle.
It was an execution.
Elder. Ilrisven's voice was barely above a whisper. Enemy casualties are... They are in the millions. The swarm is breaking. They are fleeing.
Fleeing.
In 6 months of war, Verethkin had never seen the harvesters flee. They advanced, they consumed, they grew. They did not run.
The battle lasted 9 hours.
By the end, the harvester swarm that had emerged from the direction of Velthora Prime had been reduced to scattered fragments, fleeing into the void with what could only be described as terror. The human fleet had lost 11 ships, a number that seemed impossibly small given the scale of the engagement.
The harvesters had lost everything. Verethkin stood in the observation chamber as Captain Chen entered, her uniform showing no signs of the battle that had just been won.
Behind her, through the crystalline walls, the stars were visible again, no longer blotted out by the swarm, but burning with their eternal, indifferent light.
"It's not over," Chen said without preamble. "This was a forward element. The main harvester concentration is still at your homeworld. We'll need to advance, push them back, establish a containment perimeter." "You speak as if victory is certain," Verethkin said quietly.
I speak as if we're prepared to do whatever it takes. Chen's dark eyes met his. The second wave arrived during the battle. The third wave is en route. Every hour, more ships join the fleet. In 72 hours, we'll have enough firepower to take the fight to Velthora Prime itself.
"Why?" The word came out before Verathikin could stop it. "Captain, you have already done more than we could have imagined. You have proven that the harvesters can be fought, can be stopped. You could withdraw now, establish defenses around your own systems, protect your own people. Why continue to fight for us?" Chen was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her years.
3 centuries ago, Elder, your council looked at humanity and saw a violent, self-destructive species that was not worth saving. You were right about the violence. You were right about the self-destruction. What you missed was everything else.
She moved to stand beside him at the observation window.
We are a species that has been to the edge of extinction and crawled back. We have faced horrors that should have broken us and kept fighting. We have committed atrocities against ourselves that make the harvesters look merciful, and we have learned from them. Her voice grew quieter. We know what it is to be alone in the dark, screaming for help that never comes. She turned to face him fully, and in her eyes, Verethkin saw something that made his ancient hearts ache.
When your beacon reached us, Elder, we heard more than a distress signal. We heard ourselves. Every war we have ever fought, every plague we have survived, every time we have stood at the edge of oblivion and refused to fall, all of that was in your signal. One word, repeated 17 times.
Help! Help! Chen nodded. We know what that word means. We know what it costs to speak it, and we know what it means when no one answers. She placed her hand on his arm, a gesture of comfort that transcended species barriers. We will not let you face this alone, Elder Verethkin. Not because you deserve it, not because you treated us well, but because we remember what it was to be abandoned, and we will not do that to anyone else. The campaign to retake Velthora Prime took 3 weeks. Verethkin watched from the eternal vigilance as the human fleet advanced, system by system, world by world, driving the harvesters back toward the homeworld that they had consumed. At every engagement, the same pattern repeated: disruption, fragmentation, annihilation. The harvesters had never faced an enemy that understood them so completely. By the end of the second week, the human fleet had grown to over 8,000 capital ships. By the end of the third, it had surpassed 12,000. Manufacturing platforms followed the advance, producing replacement vessels faster than losses could deplete the fleet. Medical ships treated the wounded, both human and Velthori, with an efficiency that spoke of long experience with mass casualties. And through it all, the humans fought with a calm that Verethkin found increasingly unsettling. They do not celebrate, he observed to Chen one day, watching human crews go about their duties with mechanical precision. They do not mourn their dead with the grief that one would expect. They simply continue. We mourn, Chen replied quietly, but we have learned to do it later, to set aside our grief until the fight is over. It is not healthy, Elder. It is not kind to ourselves, but it is necessary.
How do you bear it? The weight of so much death.
Chen was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of generations. We bear it because the alternative is to let it crush us. We bear it because we have no choice. We bear it because we have learned that the universe does not care about our pain, and so we must care for each other. She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. Every human in this fleet knows that they might not survive. They fight anyway, because they know that if they do not, something worse awaits those they leave behind.
That is a terrible way to live.
Yes, Chen agreed. It is. But it has also made us very, very hard to kill.
The final battle for Velthora Prime was the largest engagement in galactic history.
The Harvesters had concentrated their forces around the burning husk of the home world, and their numbers exceeded anything that Varathkin had ever seen. Over 50 million individual units clustered so densely that they formed a living sphere around the planet. The human fleet, now numbering over 15,000 capital ships, approached in formation, and for the first time since the campaign began, Varathkin saw hesitation in the officers around him.
There are so many, Ilrizvan whispered.
Yes, he agreed. There are. But the humans did not hesitate. The quantum disruption array activated across the entire fleet, and once again the harvester swarm fragmented. But this time the effect was different. This time the pulse was followed by something else.
Missiles. Billions of them.
They had been manufactured during the advance, countless warheads produced by the mobile manufacturing platforms and distributed across the fleet. Now they launched in a wave that seemed to fill the sky, each one carrying a payload designed to exploit the vulnerabilities that the humans had discovered.
The harvester sphere shattered, and through the debris the human fleet advanced.
Varathkin stood on the bridge of the eternal vigilance, watching his dying homeworld grow larger in the view screen. Around him, human ships carved paths through the remnants of the swarm, their weapons lighting the void with continuous fire.
Elder Chen's voice came through the command channel. We are approaching optimal position for surface bombardment. The Harvesters have established processing nodes across the planet's surface. Destroying them will disrupt their ability to regenerate.
Will anything survive? Will anything remain of my world?
There was a pause. Some regions appear to have been left untouched. We believe the Harvesters were saving them for later consumption. If we act now, we may be able to preserve portions of the ecosystem.
Portions of a world that had once supported 40 billion lives. Do what you must, Varathkin said. Save what can be saved.
The bombardment began.
3 months after the human fleet arrived, the last harvester in Velthori space was destroyed. Varathkin stood in the ruins of what had once been the Grand Council chambers on Velthora Prime. The building was mostly intact, one of the few structures that the Harvesters had not yet consumed when the humans intervened. Around him, the remnants of his species walked through the wreckage, cataloging what had survived and mourning what had not. Captain Chen stood beside him, her dark eyes taking in the devastation with an expression that Varathkin had learned to recognize, sorrow tempered by resolve. We will help you rebuild, she said. The manufacturing platforms are already being retasked. Construction materials, agricultural supplies, medical equipment, whatever you need. Why? Varathkin asked.
It was a question he had asked many times over the past months, and yet he still did not fully understand the answer.
Because that is what we do, Chen replied. We fight and then we rebuild. It is not enough to destroy the enemy. You must also help those who survived. Otherwise, what was the point of fighting at all?
Varathkin looked at the human, this young, supposedly primitive being from a species that had mastered interstellar travel in a fraction of the time it had taken his own people. He thought of all the assessments, all the dismissals, all the confident predictions that humanity would destroy itself.
"We were wrong about you," he said quietly.
Yes. Not just about your technology or your military capacity. We were wrong about who you are. We saw your violence and assumed it was weakness. We saw your conflicts and assumed you would fall. We never understood what those struggles were forging you into.
Chen nodded slowly. "Hardship does one of two things to a species, Elder. It breaks them or it makes them unbreakable. For most of our history, we were being broken. Again and again, we shattered ourselves and had to pick up the pieces. But somewhere along the way, we learned to put those pieces back together in ways that made us stronger." She looked out over the ruins of the Grand Council chambers. "You called us young. You were right. We are young. But we are also very, very old. Every generation that came before us faced their own extinction, their own wars, their own darkness, and they survived. They passed down their knowledge, their resilience, their stubborn refusal to die. We are the inheritors of 10,000 years of survival, Elder. That is what you were hearing in your broken signal. That is what we answered."
Varathkin felt something shift in his understanding, a fundamental reordering of everything he had believed about the galaxy and humanity's place in it.
"What happens now?" he asked.
Now, we finish securing this region. Then we move on to the next. The harvesters are not limited to your space. They've been spreading throughout the galaxy for who knows how long. We've already detected swarms in 17 other sectors. Chen's voice carried a note of dark determination. This war is far from over.
"And you will fight it all? Every battle, every world, every species that calls for help?"
Yes. Even those who have treated you poorly? Even those who dismissed you, ignored you, left you alone in the dark? Chen turned to face him, and in her eyes, Varathkin saw the truth that he had been struggling to understand since the moment the human fleet arrived. "Especially them," she said, "because we remember what it was like to be dismissed, to be ignored, to scream for help and receive nothing but silence. We became what we are because we had to face the darkness alone. We will not do that to anyone else, no matter how they treated us." She placed her hand on his arm, just as she had done weeks ago on the observation deck. "The stars do not mourn, Elder. You told me that once. The stars burn and die, indifferent to the suffering beneath them. But we are not stars. We are human, and we will mourn every death and fight for every life and never stop reaching toward the light, no matter how far away it seems." 1 year later, Varathkin stood on a restored observation platform overlooking the reconstruction of the Grand Council city. Cranes moved in the distance, lifting prefabricated sections into place with mechanical precision. Human and Velthori workers moved together, their differences forgotten in the shared labor of rebuilding. Beside him stood Captain Chen, now Admiral Chen, commander of the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet. "How many worlds have been retaken?" Varathkin asked.
412 across 23 species. Another 200 are in active liberation campaigns. The harvesters are being pushed back on every front. And the cost? Chen was silent for a moment. High. Every victory comes with a price. But we have learned that the only alternative to paying that price is to surrender everything we are. And that is something we will never do. Verethkin looked out over the city that was slowly rising from the ashes of destruction. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, the rest of his people were doing the same, rebuilding, recovering, learning to hope again. I spoke with the restored council yesterday, he said. We discussed humanity's role in galactic affairs. There was debate. I imagine there was. Some still cling to the old assessments. They see your violence, your aggression, your unsettling capacity for destruction. They fear that having saved us, you will one day turn that power against us.
Chen nodded slowly. That is a reasonable fear.
Yes, but I reminded them of something. Verethkin turned to face the human admiral. I reminded them that 300 years ago, a broken signal reached Earth. Partial coordinates, partial identification, one word, repeated 17 times. And humanity answered. Not with questions, not with conditions, not with demands. Just answered. He reached out and placed his hand on her arm, a gesture of connection that had become natural between them.
The Council voted to extend full diplomatic recognition to the United Earth government. They voted to open trade relations, military cooperation, and cultural exchange programs. They voted to acknowledge humanity not as primitives, not as equals, but as something more.
What did they vote to call us? Verethkin's crystalline plates shifted to a shade of deep azure, the color of respect, of gratitude, of something approaching reverence. They called you what you have proven yourselves to be, the ones who answer. Chen was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried an emotion that Verethkin had rarely heard from her, something vulnerable beneath the control. We answer because we know what it means to call out and receive nothing. We answer because we have been where you are, alone in the dark, certain that no one was coming. She looked at him with eyes that held the weight of generations. We answer because it is who we are. From somewhere in the distance, a construction horn sounded, the signal that another section of the city was complete. Verethkin watched as human and Velthori workers embraced, their species differences forgotten in the celebration of shared accomplishment. The stars do not mourn, he said quietly, but perhaps they do not need to. Perhaps that is not the lesson after all. What is the lesson, Elder? Verethkin watched the sun begin to set over the city, a star like any other, burning with indifferent fire. But beneath it, beings who were not stars had chosen to care, to fight, to rebuild. The lesson, he said, is that the universe is vast and cold and uncaring. The stars burn and die without thought for what passes beneath them. But we, the small, fragile things that live in the light of those stars, we can choose to be different. We can choose to hear the cries in the darkness. We can choose to answer. He turned to face Admiral Chen, this young being from a young species that had traveled 40 light years to respond to a broken signal from strangers who had never shown them kindness. The Velthori existed for over 100,000 years before the harvesters came.
In all that time, we learned to master technology, to extend life, to build civilizations that spanned hundreds of worlds. But we never learned the lesson that humanity has taught us.
What lesson is that?
Verethkin's plates shifted to the deepest shade of blue, a color that represented in his species' visual language the highest form of truth. That the measure of a species is not what they can build, or how long they survive, or how much they know. The measure is what they do when someone cries out for help. Do they turn away? Do they calculate costs and benefits? Do they demand proof that the one calling is worthy of assistance?
He looked once more at the setting sun, at the city rising from the ashes, at the human and Velthori working together to build something new.
Or do they answer?
Admiral Chen stood beside him as the sun slipped below the horizon, its light painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. In the distance, more construction horns sounded, more sections completed, more progress made, more hope restored.
A broken SOS reached Earth, she said quietly. 17 repetitions of a single word, fragmented across 40 light-years of space. We did not know who you were. We did not know what you faced. We did not know if we could help.
She turned to face the elder, and in her dark eyes, Verethok saw the entirety of human history. Every struggle, every loss, every hard-won survival that had forged her species into what they were. But we knew what it meant to scream for help and receive silence, and so we answered. She reached out and took his hand. A gesture that transcended species, transcended history, transcended all the dismissals and doubts that had come before. We answered in force. Above them, the stars began to emerge from the darkening sky, those cold, indifferent points of light that had watched the rise and fall of countless civilizations. They did not care about the beings below them. They never had. But below them, in the warm glow of a rebuilt city, two species stood together and looked toward the future. And in that moment, Verethak understood the truth that humanity had carried with them across the stars. The universe was vast and cold and uncaring. But they did not have to be.
And for a species that had been forged in the fires of endless struggle, that had learned to answer every cry for help because they knew what silence meant, for humanity, there was no other choice.
They had heard the call.
They had come.
And they would never stop answering.